If evolution is not true, then it seems that we must find an alternative which is true. Unfortunately, I hear this often. I don't know whether you guys have or not, but quite often I hear, you can't tell. So basically people just give up and they figure, yeah, maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't. Even if they think there is, then it doesn't really matter which one, and they just don't do any more inquisition. They're not inquisitive about it whatsoever. But to me, if we're here, there has to be a reason, and if it's not evolution, if the evidence doesn't seem to point in that direction, I'd like to find out where the evidence does point. Last time we discussed a little bit of the alternatives, but at the heart of this dispute, I said it stands that is there a God? Is God the mind behind our existence? All right. We're going to get in later on into what are some of the other alternatives, and there are some really, really weird alternatives out there that people don't realize. All right. But is God the alternative? Is God the one that is the mind? If there is one, which I think there is. Is the Bible a true book? Some people say, yes, it's true. Some people say, no, it's not. Some people say some of it is and some of it isn't. Which, if some of it is and some of it isn't, then how do you decide which pieces are and which pieces aren't? We're going to get into that later also. Is Christianity the only true religion? There's a lot of them out there. All right? And if it is the only true, it claims to be the only true religion. So if you believe that, yeah, Christianity is okay and something else is okay, then you're going against, we're going to find out later on, going against what the Bible makes a claim as. It claims to be the only one. And did Jesus raise from the dead? That to me is the key issue, whether that actually took place. That's down the road. We're going to deal with it. But how can we tell if any of this is true? All right, that's important, I think. Can we prove any of those? And the answer is no. All right, none of the things we just said, just like with evolution versus mind, matter versus mind, we can't prove for sure whether evolution is true or false, but we can look at the evidence and say, hey, I think that there's overwhelming evidence here that this makes me believe what I believe. The same thing is true of these questions, all right? None of them can be proven beyond the shadow of a doubt because we've never seen God, we've never seen Jesus, etc. So the question is, how can we tell? If we want to look at the evidence, how can we tell whether these things are true? And I'm going to ask you this first. How do we know that George Washington lived? No one today has ever met him. Your grandfather never met him. How do we know that George Washington was actually a person, that he really lived and he really did most or all of the things that we've heard about?
Well, we have to trust the evidence and the eyewitnesses who claim that he existed.
Yeah. For instance, there's a guy that lived right about George Washington's time called John Marshall, who wrote the first life story of George Washington. Okay? And this was within a few years of his death. I don't remember the exact time that book was written, but it wasn't very long after George Washington died that this guy wrote a book. He knew George Washington. He lived at the same time as George Washington. And there are a lot of other books since that have gone back and talked about George Washington. Where did they get their information from? From this guy? From other documents that George Washington wrote? That other things that people wrote about George Washington that knew him? From the things that happened in the Continental Congresses, from the things that happened in the Army when he was general, things that were documented of his plantation and the things that he did before he was in the war and afterwards. There's a lot of evidence out there that George Washington really lived and did the things that we think he did. Some of them might be a little controversial, like the cherry tree thing. Some people say that didn't happen, but that doesn't really matter to me. The same is true of the Bible. Someone wrote the books, and it claims to be true. Last week we mentioned several things, several verses in the Bible where it says that the Bible claims that it is true. And there's some of them for the Old Testament, some of them from the New Testament. And we even have words from Jesus that say, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of God. Jesus, this man that the book is about, is claiming not only that there is a God, but that the words that God spoke are the truth. The Bible is the words that God spoke, sometimes through other people, which is a problem that some people have. We'll talk about that again later. But the point is, what does this mean? Jesus is saying that food is not the only thing that sustains our life. Instead, it is the very words of God that God speaks, which give us what we need to survive. The Bible claims to be God's words, all the way from Genesis 1 through Revelation 22. And therefore, as we have emphasized many times so far, there is enough evidence that tips the scales in favor of the idea that an all-knowing and all-powerful God wrote the Bible as our moral code to live by. That's what we're going to try to show. But more importantly than that, is there enough evidence that the Bible is a true historical story about the promised seed that would come and redeem mankind? And is the Bible, is it true that Christianity is based on the fact that Jesus dies and resurrected from the dead, and that his followers are the reason that the church was established? How do we go about investigating these claims, whether they're true or false? In other words, did this God leave any kind of evidence for us to make this decision? Is the Bible verifiable? You can pretty much go back and within reason verify that the things that were written about George Washington were true. Can you do the same thing with the Bible and the things that are written about Jesus and the things that are written in the Old Testament? And over these next quite a few weeks, that is what my goal is going to be, is to show that it is reasonable to believe this, counter to what many people, even in the churches today, lots of different churches, happen to think. If a book like the Bible claims that it's real history, then shouldn't it be verifiable? Shouldn't the history be correct? Shouldn't the science be correct? Shouldn't the prophetic claims be able to be shown to be correct? Shouldn't its story be consistent throughout its pages? And shouldn't its geography and its culture be correct when it speaks it for the time period it speaks of? We're going to watch a video a few weeks down the road, at least part of it, where a guy's going to show some things from the New Testament that, well, for instance, if you tried now to write a story and try to make it sound like it was written by somebody that lived 200 years ago. Not just that it sounds like, you want to make it so that you would fool people into thinking that it was actually written not by you now, but by somebody 200 years ago. What kinds of stuff would you have to know?
That your F's are actually S's, or your, which one is it?
Okay. Yeah, that's some literature type things, but I'm talking about even physical stuff in the story. What's some things that are different 200 years ago than they are today? Boundary lines, government, names. In other words, we don't use all the same names today that they did 200 years ago. Do you know what those names are? Do you know the proportion that those names were in? Like today, there's certain names that are that are highly used more than there were even 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. Let alone 200 years ago. Do you know that the dialect? You don't know these things. You could look some of it up on the internet, but people that wrote the Old Testament didn't have the internet. So, how would they have known, say, and this is an honest claim that we're going to talk about later, an honest claim that people think that Genesis, which claims to be written around 1500 BC, 3,500 years ago, was actually a conglomeration of stories and wasn't written down until more like 600 or 700 BC. Like 700 to 1,000 years after it was actually written. How would those people, 700 to 1,000 years after this stuff happened, know how to write it in such a way where it was accurate according to the time that it's supposed to have been written? And that would have been an impossible task. We're going to talk about a few of those things, just a few, today, here in just a minute. Many people today who object to the Bible being true base their objections on a few passages in Genesis. Things like the creation account in Genesis chapter 1 and 2 and the flood, chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9. These are the two most ridiculed. All right? But I don't start there. If I can give enough evidence that shows that the Bible is true in a lot of other areas, and that we have a God that knew stuff that shouldn't have been able to know stuff, like prophecies and things, which we're going to get into in detail, then maybe I can show it's a little bit easier to swallow that the things in Genesis really did happen. So we're not going to start there. We're going to end there. We're going to talk about that much later. The first thing we're going to talk about today, though, is some things that the Old Testament talks about that cross over into secular history. The Bible mentions them, and secular historians mention them. In other words, let's see if we can tie the Old Testament to a real history that we know for sure. That was a big one I had problems with when I was in high school and early college, especially when I first took a college history class on ancient world history, and all of a sudden, this guy's flipping back and forth, and I studied the Bible as a kid, and I'm thinking, okay, how does this, what I learned in the Old Testament, how does this fit with the history that this guy's teaching? It took me a long time to figure a lot of that out. It was difficult to do, but we're going to do some here that's pretty easy. First of all, we're going to talk about the Hittites. Anybody ever heard of the Hittites? They played a prominent role in the Old Testament. They interacted with biblical figures all the way from Abraham to Solomon. So at least 1,000 years of Old Testament history. They were mentioned in Genesis chapter 15 as the people who inhabited the land of Canaan. Abraham bought Sarah's burial plot from the Hittites. 1 Kings chapter 10 records the Hittites purchased chariots and horses from King Solomon. And Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba, and King David's best friend, was a Hittite. In fact, King David, it says, had Uriah killed. Right? So at that point, the Hittites were friends with Israel. Even though David betrayed his best friend because of what he did with his best friend's wife. Prior to the 1800s, the late 1800s, just before 1900, nothing in modern history or archaeology was known about the Hittites. In fact, most Bible critics, people that didn't think the Bible was true, alleged that it was an invention of the Bible. They didn't believe the Hittites were a real nation because the Bible talked about it, didn't mean anything to them. They couldn't find any evidence at all. Then, in 1878, there was a discovery that changed this perception. There was a British scholar, this guy right here, Sayce, not sure. He found an inscription in Turkey on some rocks that turned out to be from the Hittite nation. So for hundreds of years, nobody believed that the Hittites existed, and all of a sudden this guy found an inscription that mentioned the Hittites in Turkey. Guess what they found since? This is the Hittites' Lion Gate. They know where the city and the nation live now. This is the Great Sphinx at the Hittite Gate. This, and I don't know how anybody would drink out of that thing, but that's a big cup. All right? Very fancy. But that cup is a Hittite cup. More importantly, this is in Egypt. This is a Hittite-Egypt peace treaty written on the wall of a large stone in Luxor, Egypt. So not only, they weren't a minor nation, if they made a peace treaty with the Egyptians, they had to be pretty big. Okay? This was no small, this was found after they found the fact that the Hittites actually did exist. This right here is the Egyptian-Hittite peace treaty from 1256 BC between Ramses II and this king. This right here was found in the Hittite territory. So in other words, they've got a treaty in Egypt between the two nations, and they got a treaty now in the things that they found in the Hittite area where the Hittites lived that confirm each other. The Bible's been talking about it forever since it was written. Now it's confirmed in real life. But there's even more to it than that. This is actually more important, I think. This peace treaty also discredits those who say the Bible was not written prior to 1000 BC. So Moses wrote 1500 BC, and he wrote about stuff that happened thousands of years before that. But, as we're going to see later, modern historians and archaeologists that don't believe in the Bible make the claim that the Bible wasn't written until much later than that, way closer to Jesus' time, 400, 500, 600 years before Jesus, instead of 1500 years before Jesus. But that can't be true for this reason. The ancient Near East of the second millennium used a treaty format, a peace treaty format. You find it in both that wall in Egypt and in the markings and tablets that they found in the Hittite area. That was had actually a specific name called the Hittite Vassal Treaty. This treaty had a very specific structure, and there was hardly any, if any, variability of it for over 1,000 years. It was used in a lot of different areas, and it was used over and over and over again, and every time an archaeologist finds it, they know that it's this kind of treaty and what period it has to be from, because that's the only kind of treaty format that they used. More importantly than that, after 1000 BC, in other words, 800, 700, 600, 500, a different treaty format was used. Totally different treaty format was used after that point. Now, this treaty format was used from 3000 roughly to 1000, and the new one was used after that. Guess how the structure of Exodus, Deuteronomy, and Joshua are written? And it's Exodus chapters 20 through 31, Deuteronomy chapter 1 through 31 and Joshua chapter 24, they're all written in the form of the old treaties format. They could not have been written up here. They had to have been written back when the Bible claims they were written. Because that new treaty format, they stopped using the old one, so it could not have been used up in this area here, in the newer area. This destroys the argument by atheists that the Old Testament is only an afterthought and not true history. Nothing like this kind of historical accuracy is found in any other kind of book. The Bible contains many such secrets and archaeological which archaeologists and historians have learned to rely on over the centuries. But it's this, isn't this what we should expect from a book that is actually written by an all-knowing God telling the truth? I want to briefly mention now some other Old Testament examples. Okay? First one. This is a guy named This is a guy named Shalmaneser III, who was king of Assyria from 859 to 824, and he is mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 17. Now this is what's known as a stele, and a stele is simply a tall piece of stone where information is written on. It's like a document that public could come and read, kind of like the internet is today, only it was all in one place. So if you passed by, you could read the most modern news. There's lots of these steles and things like that that they have throughout the old ancient world at this time. This is the Kirk stele, and it records an Assyrian victory. And that is also recorded, the same one, in 2 Kings 17, 3 through 6. So here we have a stele that obviously came from the time period that the Bible wrote in 2 Kings, and the two of them agree with each other. They both mention, the Ahab is mentioned on both of these steles, and it confirms what the Bible says. Okay? Another one. A bulla. A bulla is a clay seal that was used to verify important documents. Kind of like the king's signature ring. So in more modern times, they would take and put wax on a document, close the document, put wax on it, take the king's ring, put it on there, and everybody recognized that king's ring, and that seal can't be broken unless it's by an official person that knew. That's kind of what a bulla was. And here's an example of a bulla back in 700 some BC. Guess what? It belongs to King Ahaz. King Ahaz was a king that is mentioned in 2 Kings 16, Isaiah 7 through 9, and 2 Chronicles 28, Isaiah 7 through 9. This is not, I mean, you can't say that Ahaz didn't exist because they got his bull up. Okay? So the things, it gives more credibility to the fact that what the Bible's writing about that king is true. This is the bull of Hezekiah. Mentions Hezekiah. And of course, Hezekiah is the king that is in 2 Kings chapters 18 through 20 and 2 Chronicles and in Isaiah. They got his bull also. Crossover between what happened, what the Bible says, and what happened in real history. Speaking of Hezekiah, this is kind of a drawing and a depiction of Hezekiah's water system they call it his water tunnel, mentioned in 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verse 30. Now, this was built, supposedly, according to the Bible, by Hezekiah, so that if Israel was surrounded, they could still get water and there wasn't going to be a problem. Right? There's a whole story about that. So it's not just that it's mentioned in passing. They talk a lot about it in the Bible. For years, everybody thought this was just nonsense because, this is kind of a big undertaking to make a tunnel like that. Until this guy found it. They actually know where Hezekiah's tunnel was now. And that's a picture taken by a guy named Peter Williams. In 2 Chronicles chapter 32, verse 30, it says, Hezekiah closed the water outlet of the waters of Gihon, and directed them down the west side of the city of David, talking about that tunnel. Here's another one. This lady is pointing to where King Jehu's name appears on a black obelisk, an obelisk and a, what do we call those other things?
Stele?
Yeah, steel. Yeah, are kind of the same thing, all right? King Jehu is mentioned in 2 Kings chapters 9 and 10. He was one of the kings of Israel, and they have his name on an outside source. This is what's known as the Mesha stele, or a lot of times it's referred to as the Moabite stele. And it's the earliest non-biblical reference to the name Yahweh. Yahweh is God's formal name. One of the controversies we're going to see that people try to disprove the Bible was written when it was written and it wasn't written by God himself is the name changes that happen throughout the Old Testament. I know it sounds silly, but we're going to get into that when we talk a little about something called the documentary hypothesis later on. But this idea that Israel had these several different names for God seems preposterous to certain groups of people that don't want to believe in God, so that they say that, well, that wasn't written then, it had to be written here, and then it had to be collected, and it was all put together just a couple hundred years or so before Jesus lived. Well, here's proof positive that one of those names existed way back, because the stele is really old, and I'm trying to remember. Yeah, this is 841 BC. No, that's not. I don't think I put down when that was discovered. Yeah, 876 BC is when they have to date that time. There's a guy named Sanballat that is mentioned in Nehemiah 10 separate times. His name is written on a papyrus that has been dated to 473 BC. He's mentioned in the book of Nehemiah. He was a leading person in the opposition which Nehemiah encountered during the rebuilding of the temple walls. Okay, so this was after Judah was in Babylonian captivity, and they had come back, and in Ezra and Nehemiah and a couple other books, they were rebuilding that temple. All right, this is a document that mentions that guy's name that is in Nehemiah 2:19. Mentioned in the papyrus and mentioned in the Old Testament book also. Several times in the Old Testament book. Sennacherib. He was an Assyrian king that's well known, and he's talked about quite a bit. He was a contemporary of King Hezekiah and is mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 19. In this prism, which dates from 700 BC, mentions both Hezekiah and Sennacherib in the same stele. Okay? Actually, it's a prism because it's not flat like a regular stele, so they call this one a prism because it looks like it's got probably 6 sides to it. Right? Hezekiah, Sennacherib. The Bible talks about both of them knowing each other. This stele does too. It says the exact same thing. There is a scribe named Shebna who was sent by the king to confer with the Assyrian ambassador as recorded in 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 18, 26, 37, chapter 19, verse 2, Isaiah chapter 36, verse 3, verse 11, verse 22, and Isaiah chapter 37, verse 2. He's mentioned on this limestone slab. He's a scribe that was sent by the king to confer with the Assyrian ambassador and recorded in those places. This is where the exact same information is recorded in real time, real life history. In ancient times, a lot of times things that were chiseled into some kind of stone were written in clay tablets. And clay tablets they have found in all over the Mesopotamian area, lots of different areas that had this. They used a stylus. You've probably seen that before where they press different kinds of shapes in and it would be the writing that they used at the time. Here's one such clay tablet in uniform script, and it's a receipt for payment made by a guy named Nebo, and I got this so I can pronounce it here, Sarshakim. Now sometimes it's hard to figure out whose name is who because if it's in another place in the world at the time, that language offers a different spelling. But basically that one and the one that is in parentheses there is the exact same name. Okay? He was an official of Nebuchadnezzar, and his name is mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 39, verse 3. It's the same person. This is what it says in Jeremiah 39, 3. All the princes of the king of Babylon came and took their seats in the middle of the gate. And that guy, I'm not going to try to pronounce his name again, a chief officer, and another guy, a high dignitary, and all the rest of the princes of the king of Babylon. Mentioned in the Bible, mentioned in that clay tablet. Exactly the same thing. Have you ever heard of a tel, T-E-L?
Yeah.
You know what it is?
I think it's very similar to it, but
No.
okay, then
It's a huge mound of dirt. Lots of them across the Middle East. That's a tel. I don't know why they use that word, but that's what it's called. And what they know is that when they start digging at the top of these tels, they find layers like this, layer after layer after layer. And what happened in ancient times, when a city collapsed, whether it was conquered, whether the people died off, someone else would move in, they would use the materials that they could from the old one, bring in new materials, and rebuild on another level. And this would happen time after time after time, until finally, when the last nation died out, all that was left after years of deterioration was a big mound of dirt. Now they can dig down into those mounds of dirt. They can find the different civilizations that happened one after another. One such place they do this is one called Tel Dan. Now, you can see that they've done a lot of digging. They found this this building inside of it, and they've got this thing over the top of it to protect it somewhat so that it doesn't get destroyed while they're researching it. Tel Dan, I don't remember where it was here, was first found in 1966. I was in high school. But it wasn't until 1993 that they excavated this. This is a piece of stone that was in that tub. And as they researched the thing, looked into it, it's not very big. This is what they found down in this corner. House of David. There's a sentence about the House of David. But since a lot of it's gone, they don't know everything that was said. But the point is that the Bible mentions the House of David, and a lot of people up until that time didn't really think that David was a real king, and if he was, that Israel was so insignificant that it wouldn't be written in history. And yet here at Tel Dan, the House of David is mentioned. So now they know for sure that David was a real king. And since that time, they found out a lot more about the things that David had constructed and the treaties that he made with various other nations. They know that he's not only a real person, but that Israel was significant at that time. But for decades, they didn't, and they scoffed at the Bible for making that claim. This is an Egyptian pharaoh, 945 BC. Okay? He made what's known as a city list. This is a list of cities that this pharaoh made. Bunches and bunches of cities. The Bible records attacks from Judah, an attack from Judah's perspective, but this list gives much more detail on the same attack, plus it gives the names of over 150 cities that were in existence at that time. Most of them can't be located today. So if the Bible mentions some of these cities, people could say, well, we don't know where that is, so the Bible's probably not telling the truth. Except for, guess what? These cities are confirmed not only on that stone, but they're in the Bible. These are the ones that they know for sure exist that they found on that stone, and they're all listed in the Bible in various places. Giving more credence to when the Bible talks about cities and areas and geography and that sort of culture and that sort of thing, it's telling the truth because we got verification from outside sources. These are what's known as the Ebla tablets. This was kind of a big deal. I remember when this happened because they found them in 1975. I was well out of high school by then, and I remember a guy. Did you guys go to Lapeer Church at all?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember Jack Slater?
The name sounds familiar.
Yeah, Jack Slater used to go here, and then he moved to Lapeer. Now he's like in Tennessee. He's living with his daughter or something down there. I can't remember. I haven't seen him in quite a while. He was the first one that said, hey, they found some tablets called the Ebla tablets. I still remember him first telling me about those. I didn't think much of it at the time, but the point is that these Ebla tablets have a lot of important information on them, and they date back to 2500 to 2300 BC, which is about the time of Abraham. Not only do they date back that far, but they mention the city of Haran, where Abraham lived after he left Ur and before he got to the promised land where he lived as a vagabond the rest of his life. Crossover between this stone and Genesis. And the last one I want to mention here is Jericho, which is a really, really controversial one. This is a photo of a guy named Bryant Wood, and he's pointing to the place where the wall came tumbling down. All right? So They know that the walls fell, like Joshua says, okay, when they circled the city and then all of a sudden the walls fell. They also know that when the walls fell, they would not usually fall out. They would usually fall in because they were battered from the outside. But still, that didn't deter a lady named Catherine Kenyon, who dated Jericho as much later than what the Bible story had indicated that it was. Thus saying, she said that the Bible was wrong. She did this by looking at the pottery. Now, you might not think that that's a big deal, but can you tell the difference between these two pieces of pottery? And when each one of them would have been made? These are both American potteries. See, we're not skilled enough. This is Wedgwood from the 1800s. This is Corel, which is made out of unbreakable material that wasn't until like the 1960s. I remember when Corel first came up. Now it's kind of commonplace. Do you think you'd find Corel back in the 1800s? No, you couldn't. It wasn't invented. Do you think you'd find Wedgwood in some places up in the 1900s? The answer is yeah, because some people collected it. Maybe it's still made somewhat by people that like it. Old pieces have been in museums and that sort of thing. What Catherine Kenyon did was base her opinion on how old that Jericho site was destroyed by what pottery she did not find. She wanted to find certain pottery and she didn't find it, so she concluded that it didn't happen at the time she thought. But later evidence has shown that other pottery confirmed the older date. In fact, a guy named John Garstein dated the site in correlation with the Bible, but Kenyon had an agenda, and therefore it was her dates that still are accepted today, even though lots of people think they're probably wrong. Why? Because Catherine Kenyon was an atheist, and she did not want the Bible to be right. So guess which of the dates are used for Jericho nowadays? Hers. Because most people don't want to believe that the Bible is correct on this, even though it is. This is a room that, this is the room, a room, that looks like the same one that Rahab would have used in the retaining wall in Joshua chapter 2:15. So the Bible's accurate in having those kinds of, recording those kinds of things. You ever heard of Occam's razor? Yes? Okay, good. When you have two competing theories that make exactly the same prediction, the simplest one is better. You guys ever watched The Big Bang Theory? This is like a 55-second excerpt from it, where Sheldon didn't want the other guy, I forget his name right now, didn't want him to get a letter, so he threw it in the waste can. And this is what happened after he did that. Oops.
Occam's razor would suggest that someone threw it out.
In other words, he's trying to go against Occam's razor and say, I didn't do that. Trash can just formed around it, but Occam's razor would say that wouldn't be true. Well, I think the same thing is true with some of the things we're going to be talking about. Occam's razor says that if you find enough evidence that shows that the Bible is verifiable, then the skeptics must be wrong. That's what this second part of the class is pretty much about. And there's a lot of people, and I've got several quotes, I'm not going to read them all, we'll probably read some of them next time. A lot of quotes by people that say exactly the same thing, such as this one. We have a great deal of evidence from personal and place names. Discovery after discovery has established the accuracy of innumerable details and has brought increased recognition of the value of the Bible as a source of history. William F. Albright, who was an archaeologist. All right, any questions on what we talked about today? We got a lot more kinds of things I'm going to bring up, but this is the first one. In fact, I think next week we're going to talk about some New Testament archaeological things that are true before we move on. Any other questions?